The winter of 1943 brought more than snow to Auschwitz-Birkenau. It brought a test of what strength truly meant. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber stood at the edge of the roll call square, watching thousands of skeletal figures shiver in the pre-dawn darkness. Their striped uniforms offered no protection against the Polish cold. Their bodies were breaking. Their spirits, Weber believed, were already broken. "Look at them," he said to his subordinate, laughing. "These are the people who thought they were chosen? They can barely stand." What Weber didn't understand, what none of the Nazi officers could comprehend, was that the prisoners before them possessed a type of strength that no amount of cruelty could destroy. A strength that would outlast the Third Reich itself. This is the story of that strength. And how the laughing stopped. If this story moves you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to preserving these important historical testimonies so future generations never forget. Share this with someone who needs to hear this message of resilience today. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Power. The guards at Auschwitz-Birkenau had been trained to believe in a simple equation: physical power equals true power. They had guns, whips, and the authority of the Reich behind them. The prisoners had nothing but numbers tattooed on their arms and the clothes on their backs. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber had arrived at the camp in the autumn of 1942, full of ideological conviction. He had been taught that the Jewish people were weak, inferior, destined for elimination. The camp, he believed, proved this theory correct. Every day he watched prisoners stumble under loads too heavy for their malnourished bodies. Every day he witnessed the selection process, where the weakest were sent to the gas chambers. Natural selection, he would tell the younger guards during their evening meals in the warm officers' quarters. We are simply accelerating nature's process. The strong survive, the weak perish. And as you can see, they are all weak. The guards would laugh, drink their schnapps, and sleep soundly in their beds. But there were moments, brief, uncomfortable moments, when Weber noticed things that didn't fit his worldview. He noticed the way some prisoners shared their meager bread rations with others who were weaker. He noticed how they whispered prayers in Hebrew despite the punishment for such acts. He noticed the way they organized secret lessons for the children, teaching them mathematics and history on scraps of stolen paper. One day in December, Weber observed something that particularly annoyed him. A prisoner named David Goldstein, a former rabbi from Warsaw, had organized the men in his barracks to help an elderly man named Samuel who had injured his leg. They took turns supporting Samuel's weight during roll call, which lasted for hours in the freezing cold. They shared their food with him. They hid him during selections. Fools, Weber muttered to himself. Why waste their energy on someone who will die anyway? This is why they are inferior, they don't understand survival. What Weber failed to understand was that for these prisoners, survival wasn't just about preserving individual life. It was about preserving humanity itself. It was about maintaining their dignity, their faith, their connection to one another and to thousands of years of tradition and wisdom. Every small act of kindness was an act of resistance. Every prayer was a declaration that the Nazis had not won. The camp's commandant, Rudolf Haas, had designed the system to be efficient. The daily routine was calculated to maximize labor output while minimizing the cost of keeping prisoners alive. The prisoners were given approximately 1,300 calories per day while being forced to perform grueling physical labor for 12 to 14 hours. The mathematics was simple: extract maximum work, then dispose of those who could no longer be useful. But the prisoners developed their own mathematics, their own systems of survival that the Nazis couldn't calculate. They organized networks to steal food from the kitchens. They created elaborate signals to warn each other of danger. They established underground schools, prayer groups, and even cultural activities. In Barracks 27, a group of musicians who had been professional performers before the war would sometimes hum symphonies quietly at night, keeping classical music alive in the heart of darkness. Weber noticed these activities, and they irritated him profoundly. He ordered punishments, beatings, solitary confinement, reduced rations. Yet the activities continued, just more carefully hidden. One evening, Weber caught David Goldstein teaching a young boy how to read Hebrew letters, scratched in the dirt floor of the barracks with a piece of wire. Weber's first instinct was to beat them both. But something stopped him. He looked at the boy's face, perhaps 9 years old, thin as a skeleton, but with eyes full of concentration and determination. He looked at David, who met his gaze without fear. "You know this is forbidden," Weber said in German, which David understood. "Yes," David replied simply. "You know I could kill you for this." "Yes." "Then why?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because, Herr Hauptsturmführer, even here, especially here, we must remain human. The boy must know who he is. He must know his people's story. You can take our homes, our possessions, our bodies. But you cannot take what lives in our minds and hearts unless we surrender it." Weber struck David across the face and walked away. But that night, alone in his quarters, the rabbi's words haunted him. He poured himself a large glass of schnapps, but sleep did not come easily. Chapter 2, The Hidden Curriculum. As the brutal winter of 1943 deepened, the death rate in the camp increased dramatically. The gas chambers worked overtime. The crematoria burned day and night, their smoke visible for miles around the camp. Yet within this machinery of death, an underground university was taking shape. It began with Dr. Helena Rubinstein, a former professor of chemistry from Berlin. Before her deportation, she had been one of Germany's leading scientists, with 3 doctoral degrees and dozens of published papers. Now she wore a prisoner's uniform and worked in the camp laundry, scrubbing the bloodstains from SS uniforms. But Helena refused to let her mind atrophy. She began teaching chemistry and physics to a small group of younger prisoners during the brief periods when the guards weren't watching. She had no books, no paper, no laboratory equipment. She drew diagrams in the dirt. She used pebbles to demonstrate molecular structures. She explained the laws of thermodynamics while they sorted laundry in the freezing warehouse. "Why does this matter?" asked a young woman named Rachel, barely 18 years old. "Why learn about atoms and elements when we might not live to see tomorrow?" Helena looked at her student with fierce intensity. "Because, my dear Rachel, they can starve our bodies, but they cannot starve our minds unless we allow it. Every fact you learn, every concept you understand, is a victory. It is proof that you are more than a number tattooed on your arm. You are a human being with an immortal intellect." Word of Helena's lessons spread quietly through the camp network. Other educated prisoners began offering their own classes. A former mathematics professor taught geometry. A historian gave lectures on ancient civilizations. A languages teacher helped prisoners learn phrases in different languages, a practical skill that sometimes meant the difference between life and death, as those who could understand the guards' orders were less likely to be punished for mistakes. The most dangerous classes were those on Jewish history and religion, led by Rabbi David Goldstein. These were explicitly forbidden, and discovery meant immediate execution. Yet David continued teaching, believing that spiritual survival was as important as physical survival. "Our people have survived 4,000 years, he would whisper to his students in the darkness of the barracks. "We have survived the pharaohs of Egypt, the Babylonian exile, the Roman destruction, the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms of Russia. We will survive this too. But only if we remember who we are." SS Oberscharfer Friedrich Bauer, one of the camp's most brutal guards, accidentally discovered one of these secret classes one afternoon. He had been searching for prisoners who were suspected of sabotaging equipment in the munitions factory. Instead, he found 15 prisoners huddled in a corner of an unused storage room, listening intently to Helena explain Einstein's theory of relativity. Bauer was torn between rage and confusion. He had been taught that Jews were intellectually inferior, yet here was a woman explaining concepts that he himself could barely comprehend. He had expected to find criminals plotting escape. Instead, he found people hungry for knowledge, studying physics in a death camp. He arrested all of them and brought them before SS Hauptsturmführer Weber for punishment. Weber interrogated Helena personally. "Why?" he demanded. You waste your energy on useless knowledge when you should be focused on survival. This proves the inferiority of your thinking. Helena, her face already swollen from Bauer's beating, looked at Weber with something approaching pity. Herr Hauptsturmführer, you mistake the nature of survival. Yes, I need food and water and shelter to keep my body alive. But I am not merely a body. I am a mind, a soul, a person with dignity and purpose. If I surrender my intellect, if I stop thinking and learning and teaching, then I have died already, even if my heart still beats. You have the power to kill my body. You do not have the power to kill my spirit unless I give you that power. Weber ordered 20 lashes for each of the prisoners. He ordered them confined to the punishment block with reduced rations. He ordered all unauthorized gatherings to be severely punished. Yet even as he gave these orders, Helena's words echoed in his mind. That evening, Weber did something he had never done before. He went to the camp library, a collection of confiscated books taken from Jewish homes across Europe. Thousands of volumes in multiple languages, all gathering dust because the SS guards had little interest in reading. Weber found himself pulling out books on philosophy, science, and Jewish history. He didn't know why. He told himself it was to understand the enemy. But deep down, something was shifting in his understanding of what strength meant. Meanwhile, in the punishment block, Helena and her students refused to be silent. They recited chemistry formulas to each other in the darkness. They solved mathematical problems in their heads. They kept their minds alive even as the Nazis tried to break their bodies. Chapter 3, The Concert in Hell. March 1943 brought a bizarre command from Berlin. The Nazi propaganda machine needed footage showing that the concentration camps were humane places where prisoners were well treated and even had cultural opportunities. A delegation from the International Red Cross would be visiting, and the camp needed to present a civilized face. Commandant Haas ordered the creation of a prisoner orchestra. It was to be composed of professional musicians from among the camp population, and they would perform a concert for the visiting delegation. The performance would be filmed and used in propaganda materials. The order created a moral dilemma for the prisoners. To participate meant helping the Nazis with their lies. To refuse meant certain death. Yet within this dilemma, some prisoners saw an opportunity. Among the camp population was Yitzhak Perlman, a violinist who had once performed in the great concert halls of Vienna and Paris. When the Nazis came to power, his career had been destroyed. Now he was prisoner number 87432, assigned to work in the camp's carpentry shop. When the order came to form an orchestra, Yitzhak and several other musicians held a secret council. If we play for them, said Anna, a cellist from Prague, we become part of their propaganda. We help them deceive the world. But if we refuse, countered Samuel, a pianist from Warsaw, they will kill us and find others who will cooperate. And then we lose the chance to do something meaningful. Yitzhak listened to both sides, then spoke quietly. What if we play, but we play with such beauty, such profound emotion, that we remind everyone who hears us, including our captors, of our humanity? What if we show them that they have not broken us? Music is a language that transcends words. Let us speak through music what we cannot speak aloud. They agreed to participate. The Nazis provided them with instruments confiscated from Jewish homes, violins, cellos, clarinets, trumpets. Each instrument carried the ghost of its former owner, someone who had probably been murdered in this very camp. For 2 weeks, the musicians rehearsed. They were given slightly better food to ensure they would look healthy for the cameras. They were allowed to practice for several hours each day. The other prisoners watched with mixed emotions, jealousy at their better treatment, but also pride that their fellow prisoners would represent them. SS Hauptsturmführer Weber was assigned to oversee the concert preparations. He attended the rehearsals, ostensibly to ensure everything met the commandant's standards. But as he listened to the music, something unexpected happened. The prisoners performed Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, the Ode to Joy. As the music filled the rehearsal space, Weber found himself transported. He had heard this symphony before, in his youth in Munich, when the world still made sense. The beauty of the music clashed violently with the ugliness of where he was and what he was doing. He watched Yitzhak play the violin, eyes closed, his skeletal frame seeming to disappear as he became one with the music. Weber saw tears streaming down the faces of prisoner musicians, tears that spoke of lost homes, murdered families, destroyed worlds. Yet they played with such perfection, such passion, such undeniable artistry. During one rehearsal, Weber approached Yitzhak during a break. "How can you play with such feeling for us?" he asked, genuinely confused. "We are your enemies. We have taken everything from you." Yitzhak looked at him with ancient eyes. "Herr Hauptsturmführer, I do not play for you. I play for the music itself. I play for my fellow prisoners who need to be reminded that beauty still exists. I play for my wife and daughter who were murdered here, to honor their memory. I play because as long as I can create beauty, the Nazis have not won completely. You have my body, but you do not have my soul." The music proves that. The day of the concert arrived. The camp had been cleaned up for the delegation. Bodies had been removed. The weakest prisoners had been hidden. The paths had been swept. It was theater, an elaborate lie. The Red Cross delegation arrived, accompanied by SS officials from Berlin and film crews. The orchestra assembled on a specially built stage. The audience included SS officers, the delegation members, and a small group of prisoner workers who had been selected because they looked relatively healthy. As the concert began, something extraordinary happened. The prisoner musicians played with such intensity, such profound emotion, that the music transcended the propaganda purpose. Every note carried the weight of suffering and the defiance of unbroken spirits. The Ode to Joy, with its message of universal brotherhood, became a crushing indictment of the Nazi ideology. Weber stood at the back of the audience, watching. He saw the confusion on some of the delegation members' faces. How could such artistry emerge from people who were supposedly subhuman? He saw some of the SS officers shift uncomfortably, perhaps feeling, if only for a moment, the moral horror of what they were part of. When the concert ended, there was thunderous applause. The propaganda footage showed happy, healthy prisoners entertaining themselves. But those who were truly listening had heard something else, the indomitable strength of the human spirit, the power of culture and beauty to survive even in hell. That night, after the delegation had left and the illusion had been dismantled, Yitzhak and the other musicians returned to their barracks. They had no special privileges now. They would return to hard labor the next morning. Some would die within weeks. But they had won something. They had proven, even to some of their captors, that they possessed a strength that could not be destroyed. They had created beauty in the heart of darkness. And for Weber, watching from his window as snow began to fall on the camp, the simple equations of strong and weak had become far more complicated. Chapter 4, The Impossible Escape. Spring 1943 brought a glimmer of hope to some prisoners, news filtering through the camp's underground network that the tide of war was turning. The Germans had been defeated at Stalingrad. The Allies were advancing in North Africa. Perhaps, just perhaps, liberation might come. But for most prisoners, liberation seemed too distant to hope for. Their focus remained on surviving one more day, one more hour, one more moment. It was in this context that the impossible happened, a successful escape from the heart of the camp. The escapees were 4 men, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, both from Slovakia, and 2 others whose names would later be known to history. They had spent months planning, gathering information about the camp's layout, the guard rotations, the placement of the electric fences. But more than physical preparation, what made their escape possible was an elaborate network of cooperation among prisoners. Dozens of people contributed in small ways, each taking enormous personal risks. Someone in the kitchen saved extra food. Someone in the warehouse stole tools. Someone who worked in the SS offices provided information about patrol schedules. Someone in the camp hospital supplied medications. Each person knew that if the escape attempt failed, they would likely be tortured and killed. This cooperation exemplified a truth that the Nazis could never understand. True strength lies not in domination but in solidarity, not in taking but in giving, not in isolation but in community. The escape plan was audacious. The 4 men would hide in a cavity beneath a woodpile just outside the inner perimeter fence. They had learned that when prisoners escaped, the Germans conducted an intensive search for 3 days, after which they assumed the escapees had either died or gotten far away. The plan was to hide for 3 days, then emerge when the searches ended and make their way to Slovakia. To mask their scent from the search dogs, they had obtained Russian tobacco soaked in gasoline, a mixture that would confuse the dogs' sensitive noses. This tobacco had been obtained through the camp's intricate underground economy, traded through a network of prisoners and even a few sympathetic civilians who worked in the camp. On April 7, 1943, the 4 men slipped into their hiding place. Above them, they could hear the chaos as the camp authorities discovered prisoners missing during evening roll call. Dogs barked. Guards shouted. The searchlights swept across the campgrounds. SS Hauptsturmführer Weber was ordered to lead one of the search teams. He was furious. Escapes made the SS look incompetent. There would be consequences from Berlin, and those consequences would flow downhill to officers like him. For 3 days and nights, the search continued. Dogs passed within feet of the hiding place, but the tobacco mixture worked. Guards poked through the woodpile but didn't find the carefully concealed cavity. The 4 men remained absolutely silent, barely breathing, knowing that any sound could mean death not just for them but for many others. Weber became increasingly frustrated. He ordered random prisoners to be shot as punishment for the escape. He ordered brutal interrogations of anyone suspected of helping. The camp descended into an even darker level of terror than usual. Yet the underground network held firm. No one betrayed the escapees. Even under torture, prisoners claimed ignorance. This solidarity infuriated Weber more than the escape itself. He could not understand how people who were starving, exhausted, and brutalized could remain loyal to each other rather than trying to save themselves by betraying others. On the 3rd night, after the intensive search had been called off, the 4 men emerged from their hiding place. They were stiff, hungry, and terrified, but alive. They began their journey towards Slovakia, traveling at night, hiding during the day. Their escape had a purpose beyond personal survival. They carried with them detailed information about Auschwitz, its layout, its gas chambers, its death toll. They intended to reach the outside world and reveal the truth about what was happening in the camp. Their testimony would eventually reach Allied leaders and Jewish organizations, providing some of the first detailed eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust's machinery of death. Back in the camp, word of the successful escape spread quietly through the prisoner network. It provided hope, a reminder that the Nazis were not omnipotent, that resistance was possible, that some might survive to tell the world what had happened here. Weber, however, drew different conclusions. The escape forced him to confront the reality that the prisoners were not the mindless, inferior beings he had been taught to believe in. The planning, the discipline, the network of cooperation required for such an escape, these things demonstrated intelligence, courage, and organizational ability. One evening, Weber found himself speaking with Commandant Haas about the escape. How did they manage it? Haas wondered aloud. They are starving, diseased, supposedly demoralized. How did they organize such a thing under our noses? Weber had no answer. But the question disturbed him deeply. It suggested that everything he had been taught about Jewish inferiority might be wrong. It suggested that the prisoners possessed reserves of strength that the Nazi ideology could not explain. In the punishment following the escape, Weber was ordered to execute 10 prisoners selected at random from the barracks where the escapees had lived. It was standard policy, collective punishment to discourage future escapes. Among those selected was David Goldstein, the rabbi who had continued teaching despite beatings and threats. As David stood before the execution wall, Weber found himself looking into the rabbi's eyes. There was no hatred there, no pleading. Just a quiet dignity, a serenity that Weber could not comprehend. "Do you have any last words?" Weber asked, following protocol. "Yes," David said quietly. "I forgive you. You know not what you do. And I want you to know that we are winning, even here, even now. You have my body, but my people will survive this. Our faith will survive this. Love will survive this. Hatred, Herr Hauptsturmführer, is not strength. It is the greatest weakness of all. Weber gave the order to fire. David fell. But his words remained, echoing in Weber's mind, disturbing his sleep, challenging everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness, victory and defeat. Chapter 5, The Children's Choice. By summer 1943, the camp had received a transport of 456 children from a Jewish orphanage in Poland. Their arrival created a dilemma for the Nazi administrators. Children were considered useless eaters in the camp economy, too small to perform meaningful labor, too young to survive the harsh conditions for long. The obvious solution, according to Nazi logic, was immediate extermination. But the camp administrators decided to conduct an experiment first. They would keep the children alive for a few weeks to see if they could be put to any productive use. The children were housed in a separate barracks, under the supervision of Jewish prisoner caregivers. Among these caregivers was Esther Hoffmann, a former schoolteacher from Krakow. Before her deportation, she had taught literature and philosophy to teenagers. Now, at 32 years old and weighing barely 40 kilograms, she found herself responsible for helping care for these doomed children. The children ranged in age from 4 to 14. Most had been separated from their parents. All had witnessed horrors no child should ever see. Many had watched their parents being shot or beaten. They had endured the cattle cars, the selection process, the terrifying arrival at Auschwitz. Yet children possess a remarkable resilience. Within days of their arrival, despite their trauma and fear, some began to play. They created games with pebbles and sticks. They told each other stories. They sang songs they remembered from home. Esther watched them with a breaking heart. She knew their time was limited. Soon, probably within weeks, they would be sent to the gas chambers. Should she tell them? Should she prepare them for death? Or should she let them have these last days of something approaching childhood? She decided on a different approach. She would teach them. She would give them knowledge, stories, ideas, things that could live in their minds for whatever time they had left. Even if their lives were to be brutally short, those lives could still have meaning and beauty. Esther organized a secret school for the children. Every day, during the brief periods when the guards were not watching closely, she taught them. She had no books, no paper, no supplies. But she had her memory and her imagination. She taught them mathematics, drawing numbers in the dirt with sticks. She taught them geography, describing the world beyond the camp's barbed wire, mountains and oceans, cities and forests, all the beautiful places they would never see. She taught them literature, reciting from memory the poems and stories she had loved as a child. Most importantly, she taught them their own history and culture. She told them stories from the Torah, Moses leading the people out of slavery in Egypt, David defeating Goliath, Esther saving her people from destruction. She taught them Hebrew words and simple prayers. She explained Jewish holidays and traditions. "Why are you teaching us these things?" asked a girl named Sarah, who was 7 years old. "The guards say we are nothing. They say we don't matter." Esther knelt down to look Sarah in the eyes. "The guards are wrong, my darling. You are not nothing. You are part of an ancient people with a beautiful heritage. You matter. Each of you matters more than you can possibly know. And as long as you remember who you are, as long as you keep learning and growing and loving, they have not won." SS Hauptsturmführer Weber learned about these teaching activities from one of his subordinates. He was ordered to investigate and stop them. When he arrived at the children's barracks one afternoon, he found Esther teaching a group of children about the stars and constellations. "This is forbidden," Weber said sharply. "These children are not to be educated. They are to be kept quiet until they're processing." Esther stood up slowly. She was painfully thin, her eyes sunken, but she held Weber's gaze without flinching. "Herr Hauptsturmführer, these children will die soon. You know this. I know this. They know this. What harm does it do to let them learn something beautiful in their last days? What harm does it do to let them feel human for a little while longer? Weber was taken aback by her directness. It wastes time and resources. No, Esther replied quietly. What wastes time is this entire monstrous enterprise. What wastes resources is using trains and guards and gas and bullets to murder children who have done nothing wrong. I am giving these children the only thing I can give them, knowledge and kindness and a reminder that they are loved. If that is a crime, then you may punish me. But I will not stop. Weber should have arrested her immediately. He should have beaten her, perhaps killed her on the spot. But something stopped him. He looked at the children sitting in a circle around her. They looked at him with fear, yes, but also with defiance. They were not cowering. They were not begging. They were simply being children, wanting to learn, wanting to live. He turned and left without saying another word. That evening, Weber sat alone in his quarters, drinking heavily. He thought about his own children back in Germany, 2 sons, 8 and 10 years old. He thought about how excited they got when they learned new things, how proud he felt when they showed him their schoolwork. He thought about how he would feel if someone told him his children were going to be murdered, and how desperate he would be to give them whatever comfort and joy he could in their last days. The comparison made him physically ill. He vomited into his wastebasket and continued drinking. Meanwhile, in the children's barracks, Esther continued teaching. She knew she was living on borrowed time, that Weber or another guard would eventually stop her permanently. But every lesson she taught, every story she told, every moment of normalcy she created for these children was a victory against the darkness. The children began to change. Despite their circumstances, despite knowing their fate, many began to show remarkable strength. They helped each other. They shared their meager food. They comforted those who cried at night. They learned to read Hebrew letters that Esther traced in the dirt. They memorized poems and prayers. One boy, 10-year-old Jacob, asked Esther a profound question: if God is good, why does he let this happen to us? Esther had no easy answer. She struggled with the same question herself every day. Finally, she said, I don't know, Jacob. I truly don't know. This is one of the great mysteries, and wiser people than me have struggled with it for thousands of years. What I do know is that God gave us free will, the ability to choose good or evil. The men who are doing this to us have chosen evil. But we can still choose good. We can still choose to love each other, to help each other, to remember that we are human beings created in God's image. Our strength is not in our muscles or our weapons. Our strength is in our ability to remain good even when surrounded by evil. That is true power. 2 weeks later, the order came. The children were to be sent to the gas chambers the next morning. Esther was informed by another prisoner who worked in the camp administration offices. She spent that last night with the children, telling them stories, singing them songs, holding them as they cried or slept. She told them they were going on a journey, that they should not be afraid, that their parents and grandparents would be waiting for them in a better place. At dawn, the children were loaded onto trucks. Esther insisted on going with them, though as a caregiver she could have stayed behind. She held their hands. She sang to them. She walked with them into the gas chamber, still singing, still teaching, still loving them until the very end. SS Hauptsturmführer Weber watched from a distance. He had been ordered to oversee the operation. He watched Esther walk calmly into the chamber with the children. He heard the singing even after the door was sealed. He heard it stop. And for the first time since he had arrived at Auschwitz, Klaus Weber understood what true strength looked like. It wasn't the strength of guns and guards and gas chambers. It was the strength of a woman who chose love over hate, who chose to comfort children even as she walked toward her own death, who chose humanity even in the most inhuman place imaginable. He went to his quarters and, for the first time in his adult life, wept. Chapter 6: The Last Laugh. By the autumn of 1944, it was clear to everyone, even the most dedicated Nazis, that Germany was losing the war. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. The Third Reich's much-vaunted thousand-year empire was collapsing after barely 12 years. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazi administrators began destroying evidence of their crimes. The gas chambers were demolished. Documents were burned. Prisoners who had worked in the crematoria, the Sonderkommando who knew too much, were systematically murdered to eliminate witnesses. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber had changed over the past 2 years. The confident, ideological true believer who had arrived in 1942 had been replaced by a haunted man who drank too much and slept too little. He had witnessed too much. He had participated in too much. And despite all his training, despite all the propaganda, he could no longer avoid the truth. Everything he had believed was a lie. The prisoners were not weak. They were not inferior. They possessed a strength that Weber and his fellow Nazis could never comprehend because it was a strength born of love, community, faith, and moral courage rather than violence and domination. In November 1944, Weber was ordered to oversee the evacuation of several thousand prisoners who would be force-marched westward as the Soviet army approached. These death marches would kill thousands more prisoners who had somehow survived the camps but were now too weak to endure long marches in winter conditions without food or shelter. Among the prisoners being marched out was Rabbi David Goldstein, or rather, someone who looked remarkably like David, whom Weber had believed he had ordered executed months earlier. Weber approached the man in confusion. "You? I ordered you shot." During the reprisals after the escape. David looked at him calmly. "Yes, Herr Hauptsturmführer. You gave that order." But the soldier who was supposed to execute me found that his rifle had mysteriously jammed. In the confusion, another prisoner's body was recorded as mine. Several guards and prisoners conspired to hide me and transfer me to a different barracks. It seems that even among your ranks, there were some who retained a conscience. Weber was stunned. "Why are you telling me this? I could have you executed right now." "Yes, you could," David acknowledged. "But you won't. I have watched you over these years, Herr Hauptsturmführer. I have seen you change. I have seen the ideology crack and the humanity begin to show through. You are no longer the man who arrived here in 1942. You know the truth now, even if you cannot speak it aloud." Weber stood silent, unable to deny it. David continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You wanted to know who was strong and who was weak. You thought it was obvious, you had the guns, we had nothing. But look around you, Herr Hauptsturmführer. Your 1,000-year Reich is falling after 12 years. You tried to destroy us, to prove we were inferior, to eliminate us from the earth. But we are still here. Broken, yes. Diminished, yes. But not destroyed. We survived Egypt. We survived Babylon. We survived Rome. We survived the Spanish Inquisition. We will survive this. Our strength is not in our weapons but in our will to live, our faith, our commitment to each other, and our hope for a better world. That is a strength that cannot be killed." Weber found he had no response. David was right. Everything Weber had believed about strength and weakness had been inverted. The Germans, with all their military might, were losing. The Jews, despite being subject to the most systematic attempt at extermination in human history, would survive. As the death march prepared to depart, Weber made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him 2 years earlier. He secretly provided extra rations to several prisoners, including David. He gave them blankets and warmer clothing from the camp stores. He falsified documents to reclassify some of the weakest prisoners as essential workers who would be transported by truck rather than marched. These were small acts, insufficient to redeem him for the enormous crimes he had participated in. But they were something. They were evidence that even in a person who had committed terrible evil, some capacity for good might still exist. The death march departed in a blizzard. Thousands would die along the way. But some would survive, including David Goldstein. Weber did not go on the march. He had been reassigned to help with the final destruction of evidence at the camp before the Soviet liberation. As he watched the prisoners disappear into the snowy darkness, he understood with bitter clarity that they were marching toward freedom while he was marching toward judgment. In January 1945, the Soviet Army liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. They found approximately 7,000 survivors, most of them barely alive. They also found warehouses full of human hair, thousands of suitcases with names painted on them, rooms full of eyeglasses and shoes, and the physical evidence of the greatest crime in human history. Weber had fled before the liberation. He destroyed his SS uniform and identification papers, assumed a false identity, and attempted to disappear into the chaos of defeated Germany. For several years, he succeeded. He moved to a small village in Bavaria, took a job as a carpenter, married a local woman who knew nothing of his past, and tried to build a normal life. But he could not escape his memories. Every night, he saw the faces of those he had murdered or sent to their deaths. He saw the children walking into the gas chamber with Esther. He heard David's words about strength and weakness. He remembered the underground university, the secret concerts, the networks of solidarity that had persisted even in hell. In 1961, Weber saw newspaper reports about the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. The trial was bringing renewed attention to the Holocaust. Survivors were testifying. The world was finally listening to what had been done. Weber, now 50 years old and living under an assumed name, made a decision. He wrote a detailed confession, hundreds of pages describing his role at Auschwitz, the crimes he had witnessed and participated in, and his gradual recognition of the truth about strength and weakness, about who was truly human and who had become something less than human. He included one particular observation that would later be quoted by historians: "We thought we were the strong ones because we had the power to kill. We thought they were weak because they could not stop us. But we were wrong. They had the strength to remain human even when we treated them as less than animals. They had the strength to help each other when helping others meant endangering themselves. They had the strength to maintain their dignity, their culture, their faith, even in conditions designed to destroy all of these things. We had the power of death. They had the power of life. In the end, they won." Weber sent this confession to the German authorities and turned himself in. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of crimes against humanity. He spent the last 12 years of his life in prison, where he died in 1973. But before his death, he was allowed one visitor, Rabbi David Goldstein. David had survived the death march, had survived the final chaotic months of the war, and had emigrated to Israel in 1947. He had rebuilt his life, married again, had children and grandchildren. He had testified at numerous war crimes trials. He had dedicated his life to teaching about the Holocaust and ensuring that the world would never forget. When he heard that Weber was dying and had requested to see him, David agonized over whether to go. His family advised against it. "Why give that monster the comfort of your presence?" his daughter asked. But David remembered something fundamental about his faith, the possibility of teshuvah, of repentance and transformation. He remembered his own words to Weber in the camp: "I forgive you. You know not what you do." So he went. In the prison hospital, David sat beside Weber's bed. The former SS officer was gaunt, his body ravaged by cancer, looking ironically similar to the prisoners he had once tormented. "Why did you come?" Weber asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because you asked," David replied simply. "And because I said I would forgive you, and I am a man of my word." Weber began to cry, something he had done often in his final years. "I don't deserve forgiveness. What I did, what we did, it was unforgivable." "Perhaps," David acknowledged. "I cannot speak for all the victims. I can only speak for myself. And I choose to forgive because holding on to hatred would destroy me as surely as your hatred destroyed you and your comrades. You asked in the camp who was truly strong. I told you then, and I tell you now, strength is not in domination but in the ability to love despite having every reason to hate. Strength is not in taking life but in affirming life. Strength is not in revenge but in choosing a better path." "We laughed at you," Weber whispered. "We thought you were weak, pathetic. But you were right about everything. You were strong. We were weak. We just couldn't see it." David sat silently for a moment, then said, the greatest tragedy is not just what was done to us, but what was done to you, how you were taught to hate, how your humanity was poisoned, how you were transformed into an instrument of evil. You found your way back to humanity, though far too late. That is worth something, though it cannot undo what was done. They sat together for an hour, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. When David rose to leave, Weber grasped his hand weakly. "Tell them," Weber said. "Tell the world what you told me in the camp. Tell them what real strength looks like. Make sure they never forget." "I will," David promised. "We will. We are still here, still teaching, still remembering, still affirming life. You tried to write us out of existence. Instead, we will write you into history as a warning of what happens when people mistake cruelty for strength, when they choose hate over love, when they forget their own humanity." Weber died 3 days later. David returned to Israel and continued his work. Epilogue. In 1985, at the age of 78, Rabbi David Goldstein gave a lecture at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, on the topic of strength in the camps. The room was filled with survivors, scholars, students, and people from around the world who came to learn and remember. David, now with a long white beard and gentle eyes that had seen too much, spoke for 2 hours without notes. He told stories of the underground university, of the secret concert, of Esther and the children, of the impossible escape, of the networks of solidarity that had sustained people in the darkest place on earth. "The Nazis thought they were teaching us about power," David said. "They thought they were demonstrating who was strong and who was weak. But they taught us something else entirely. They taught us that true strength is not in the ability to harm others, but in the ability to remain human when others try to reduce you to something less. True strength is not in weapons and walls, but in the bonds of community and the power of hope. True strength is not in taking life, but in affirming it, even in the face of death." He paused, looking out at the audience. "The Nazis laughed at us. They mocked our weakness. But we had the last laugh, though it is not a laugh of joy but of survival and remembrance. We are still here. Our children and grandchildren are here. Our culture, our faith, our values, they survived. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. We have lasted 4,000 years and counting. That is strength." The audience rose in standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Many were crying, including David himself. After the lecture, a young German student approached David. She was perhaps 20 years old, born long after the war, but carrying the weight of her nation's history. "Rabbi Goldstein," she said hesitantly, "I don't know how to ask this, but how can you speak about forgiveness? How can you not hate us, Germans, for what was done?" David looked at her kindly. "Because you are not them. You did not do these things. And hatred, my dear child, is the weakness that masquerades as strength. If I hate you for things you did not do, if I let the poison of the past destroy my present, then the Nazis win retroactively. They wanted to teach us hatred. They wanted to reduce us to their level. We refused then, and we refuse now." He took her hand gently. "Your generation has a different task. Not to feel guilty for things you did not do, but to remember so it never happens again. To stand up when you see hatred and dehumanization beginning. To understand that strength is not in dominating others but in protecting the vulnerable. To choose love over hate, even when hate seems easier. That is your strength, and it is enough." The young woman was crying now. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," David replied. "Thank you for caring enough to ask. Thank you for being willing to learn. Thank you for choosing to be part of the solution rather than pretending the problem never existed." David Goldstein died in 1992, at the age of 85. He was buried in Jerusalem, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. In his eulogy, one of his students said, "Rabbi Goldstein survived Auschwitz not just physically, but spiritually. He emerged from hell with his humanity intact, his faith unbroken, his capacity for love undimmed." If you want to understand what strength really means, study his life. He proved that the Nazis were wrong about everything, wrong about who was weak, wrong about who was strong, wrong about what would last and what would crumble. Love lasts. Kindness lasts. Truth lasts. Hatred is always temporary, because hatred always destroys itself. Today, there is a tree planted in David's honor at Yad Vashem, in the Garden of the Righteous. The plaque reads, "In memory of Rabbi David Goldstein, who taught us that the greatest strength is not in the power to destroy, but in the choice to build, not in the ability to hate, but in the decision to love." The Nazi officers laughed at the Jewish prisoners, convinced of their own strength and their victims' weakness. But history had the last laugh. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years is remembered only as a cautionary tale of what happens when humanity is abandoned. The people they tried to destroy are still here, still thriving, still teaching the world about resilience, faith, and the true meaning of strength. In the end, David Goldstein was right. They won. Not through weapons or violence, but through something far more powerful, the unbreakable human spirit, the bonds of love and community, and the simple, profound choice to remain human even in the most inhuman circumstances. That is strength. That is victory. And that is a lesson the world must never forget. The end.